Good afternoon. This is Joyce Fogler with Vantage Point Consulting, and I'd like to thank those of you that have joined us for today's webinar on disaster exercise and development for the surgery centers. I'd like to thank Ann Haddox and the Indiana Federation for Surgery Centers Board for engaging us and sponsoring this training as part of the series of webinars for this year, as well as the regional trainings and workshops that are being presented, being sponsored using emergency preparedness grant funding dollars. We have those that are online muted, and those of you that are calling in on your cell or a telephone, please make sure that you've muted your phone so that we can eliminate feedback during the discussion. We will have certificates of training available at the end of the training today. Please send us an email with those of you that might be sitting together in attendance at a particular center so that we can make sure that everyone receives their certificate. Those of you that are dialing in or logging in on the GoToMeeting, we have captured your information and we'll send you an email, but we don't know if you have additional people sitting with you, or if you're calling in, we may not be able to capture that information. So at the end of the presentation, we'll provide you with the email addresses to let us know if you need certificates or training. So what we're hoping to accomplish today is to look at requirements for completing exercises for emergency preparedness, different types of exercises that you can complete. We'll talk about the components, how you go about planning an exercise, the different things to work through during the actual exercise itself, and then kind of finish off with how you evaluated that process for evaluating the exercise that you completed at your center.
Okay, you can see this okay? It's all good. Exercise out.
Okay, again, I'd like to ask anyone that's calling in on a cell phone or a landline to please put your phone on mute. There's a chat feature that you can ask questions, or we'll open up questions at the end of the session. So the first thing we want to talk about is why do we even need to do exercises? Obviously, we're required to. There's various regulations that the surgery centers fall under that require in your emergency preparedness process that you do exercises. Your emergency preparedness plan on paper is really meaningless. It must be usable, realistic, and applicable. People need to know what's in the plan, and we need to know if what we've written or what we think we're going to do actually works. And the only way to do that is through testing and exercises. And what we've learned through history and in talking with folks that have lived through major disasters, that people react the way they're trained. So if they don't have the training of how to respond in an emergency situation, they'll stumble through that and they won't respond effectively or in a positive manner. And that's very evident when we talk to those folks that were from Joplin, Missouri, or in Boston at the marathon bombing aftermath. They've stated that they managed as well as they did because they did frequent exercises. Just like you incorporate a process for training in your emergency plan, you also need to include how you're going to process through exercises. So in your emergency plan, you want to make sure that you identify key workers that will be instructed in the emergency process during emergencies. You want to develop a training schedule for making sure that your employees or your staff are trained both not only at hire but on an annual basis and frequently throughout the year that you touch base or talk about emergency preparedness. You want to schedule exercises throughout the year. You want to look at being able to cover things included in your emergency plan throughout the year, and it's obviously you can't test everything in your plan during one annual exercise, and that's why it's important to do frequent exercises if you can. You also want to, in your plan, have a methodology for how you're going to correct the deficiencies that you find during your exercises. But it's not just regulations, it's the right thing to do. But because there are certain regulations that talk about exercises as part of our emergency preparedness, I do want to touch on those highlights. On your slide, you can see the different areas that some, if not all of you, fall under, which speak to emergency preparedness and exercises. Obviously, the CMS, or the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, if you're receiving certification from them, does state that you have to do annual drills at least. Those must be followed with a written evaluation, and you must implement corrections to your plans based on your findings. I'm not going to read the entire interpretive guidelines, but just so that you know, they do require that a drill is conducted in concert with state or local authorities, and they go on to say that a fire drill doesn't qualify as the required annual drill to meet the CMS standards alone. If a fire happens as part of everything else that's going on during your exercise, that's fine, but a standalone fire drill does not qualify as the CMS required annual drill. When a surveyor comes in to evaluate against this plan, they'll look for documentation that he's completed the drill. They'll ask leadership to describe how the drill is conducted and what features of your plan that were tested. They might talk to staff as well as physicians and ask if they participated in the drill. And obviously they'll want to see your written report or your evaluation of the drill and written documentation that you've identified problems and made corrective actions for those problems that you've identified. All of you are part of or governed by the Triple HC, and their requirements are that you conduct at least one drill each calendar quarter. For their requirements, a fire drill does count for that. But again, they do require a written evaluation of the drill and that you implement corrective actions. Some of the things that they do accept as part of this drill are medical emergencies, fires, surgical fires, obviously tornadoes, hurricanes, earthquakes, as well as things like bomb threats or workplace violence, and possibly terrorist or natural or man-made kind of disasters related to chemical, biological, or nuclear threats. The requirements for CMS are going to possibly be changed, and if they are accepted, it will require that you do at least 2 exercises a year versus just the one that's in the current standards. But we'll discuss those proposed requirements in a later webinar, so stay tuned for information about that. The Indiana State Department of Health, as far as your licensing rules and regulations, there is an administrative code that is kind of vague when you're talking about emergency preparedness and exercises. However, it just says that you do have to have a plan and that it's coordinated with appropriate community, state, and federal agencies. The interpretive guidelines for this regulation state that there is that you participate on a regular basis with emergency and disaster plans, and that there's documentation of drills. They do follow when they are, as you know, surveying for license, doing a licensure survey. They do follow the CMS tags, so they kind of fall back to those CMS requirements. Some may be governed by Joint Commission, particularly if you're affiliated or owned by a hospital system.
Are they yet?
Again, please mute your phones if you're calling in so that we don't hear your conversations or feedback. So Joint Commission Emergency Management Standard states that the ambulatory healthcare centers effectively evaluate the effectiveness of their emergency management plan. And there are several different elements of performance related to this. I won't take the time here to go through those, but those of you that are under Joint Commission does require that if, or does say that you need to do at least 2 exercises a year unless you are qualified as a freestanding business occupancy, and then you only need to do 1 exercise a year. And they do not accept tabletop exercises as a method to meet this requirement. So it has to be more than a tabletop, and I'll explain those different types of exercises in a few minutes. And then it goes on to talk about that you have to incorporate disaster scenarios that evaluate your ability to handle communications, resources, security, staff, utilities, and patients. Making sure that you have representatives from administration, support, as well as your clinical services, that you document and identify deficiencies, and you modify your plan based on those findings, and you retest those corrections. Again, that's just kind of a high-level overview of the different types of regulations that require the surgery centers to perform or conduct exercises periodically. But again, most important, it's the right thing to do for the safety of your staff and your patients. So there are a lot of different types of exercises that you can do. Basically, an exercise demonstrates your capability of your emergency response, including personnel, procedures, facilities, and equipment. And you conduct those for the purpose of validating that your emergency management program is adequate. So when we talk about the different types of exercises, we'll start with a drill. These usually just test a single type of a process. They're done in kind of on the spot, in an informal basis. They usually don't take a lot of time. Examples of drills that might be conducted in the ambulatory care center to meet your AAA HC requirements do include your fire drill. You could do a communication drill, maybe activate your call tree to see how functional or how effective that is. You could do a spill cleanup drill. You could do a lockdown drill. One of the things that is required by AAA HC, as you well know, is that one of those quarterly drills does include a CPR drill. The next level of exercise is what we call a tabletop exercise. Simply stated, this is when a group of people sit at a table, they learn of a situation, they discuss how that situation would be managed, and they compare their discussion of how they would manage that along against what's in your written plans to make sure that their plans are adequate and have all the components that are necessary. Tabletops are generally used to help acquaint personnel with policies and procedures. They provide a general overview of the emergency response plan and its components to the participants. We do a tabletop exercise so that the participants have an opportunity to practice problem solving and can resolve questions regarding coordination and who does what. We structure tabletops to simulate a response to an emergency, but we don't necessarily have time to resolve all the problems that we might find. related to emergency preparedness. And you know, that's kind of, again, why we do exercises, to figure out not what necessarily goes right, although we do want to know that our plans are effective, but what could go wrong, what haven't we thought about, what other problems may creep up that we need to address in our training and our plans. So when we're doing a tabletop exercise, there's a facilitator that guides the exercise, provides input to ensure that the exercise kind of moves forward. We use the tabletop exercise to develop interaction between the team members, identify or clarify roles and responsibilities, develop general team building, identify duplications of processes or services, provide initial or continued training due to regulations or procedures, and if we have any new equipment, we definitely want to incorporate that into our training exercises. Doing a tabletop exercise is a good way to help in that training process for individuals that are not as familiar with your emergency plans and responses. So I'm going to, as we go and walk through this webinar, I'm going to give you some examples of what this would look like. So as we move through, we're going to kind of move through working through a water main break that affects the water pressure in your facility and how you would deal with that. So if we're doing a tabletop exercise, we might have the scenario that a water main break affects your center, you have low water pressure, and you're not really sure that will last. You're kind of worried that you might lose water pressure altogether. So some of the actions that you might want to discuss during a tabletop exercise are who needs to know about the problem, staff, patients, and visitors, and how you're going to tell them, how are you going to manage toileting regarding toilets and bathrooms and determine alternate methods for toileting. Do you have red bags that you could put in the toilets, or do you have toilets in other locations that you can use? If you've identified other toilets, do you have contact information for the offices or businesses nearby you that to even see if you could use their facilities? Do they have water pressure, or would they allow you to use their restroom facilities? Do you have the supplies necessary to tape off sinks so that people don't use them? Do you have an adequate supply of hand sanitizer and know where to place those in key areas? How do you get extra bottled water for hydration? Do you have a water conservation plan? What other types of systems or procedures would this affect in your day-to-day operations? And is there anybody else that you need to be working with to help manage this problem, such as your building manager or anybody else in the community, such as the water company? So you just kind of discuss all those things based on the base scenario, and while you're discussing it, make sure, again, that you look at your written plan, assuring that they have adequate responses to deal with this type of a situation. When you're doing what we call a functional exercise or an operations-based exercise, this is a little bit higher level. For this type of exercise, you do have an incident commander. They would activate and develop a team to help manage the incident. As they're made aware of the incident details, the incident management team determines the response actions that need to be taken along the way. But as these responses are discussed, it's imperative that you do what's called a walkthrough to make sure that there are no additional barriers or problems that come up that you need to also be able to manage. So a little bit different than a discussion-based or a tabletop exercise. You kind of say, we're going to do this, but in addition to just identifying that this is an action that needs to happen, you walk through your center, talk to people to see if they're able to do what they need to be able to do, and that there's no physical barriers that prevent it from being done. So again, using that same water main break as the incident, we want to make sure that if someone on the unit discovers the problem, they know that they need to alert administration. That administration then verifies the problem and makes sure that they vet the situation and find out the anticipated length of time the water is going to be off, so that they can determine the impact to the center. The incident commander would need to determine who all needs to be on the incident management team and make assignments. You want to make sure that you've alerted your staff and develop a method of ongoing communication, whether that's going to be done by paging, emails, or face-to-face communication. You also need to make sure you have a process for alerting your patients and visitors that you're doing an exercise when you're doing an operations-based exercise, because you're going to be walking around in patient care areas or in the lounge, and so they need to know what's going on. But again, going back to that example, as you discuss your responses, elevated from the tabletop exercise. So in the tabletop, we said, one of the responses would be that we would close off toilets or bathrooms and place red bags in the commodes if we had to use them. So in a functional exercise, versus just saying that's what you would do, you'd actually go to some of those toilets. Do you have the red bags? And actually place them in that area. Again, you kind of want to see how long the processes are going to take, make sure that they are really manageable. Again, you wouldn't necessarily tape off the sinks, but you would verify, again, that you have the tape available. People know where to find it. You maybe they realize that they need to write signs to post that the sinks are not accessible. For your water conservation plan, what does this really mean? Do people know if you're going to say that you're going to conserve water, that they would need to shut off coffee makers or ice makers that have automatic connections to incoming water, that they need to, if you have water fountains, to close those off and tape those off, and how to do that. And who else in your community do you need to work with? Do you actually have their contact information? And maybe even go to the point where you call the building manager and let them know that you're doing an exercise and find out how long it would take them to get to you. And are you the priority on their list for working with? Or are there other things going on that they're dealing with that prevent them from helping you immediately? Whose responsibility is it to contact the water company to kind of coordinate this situation? So again, in a functional exercise, you take the things to the next level versus just sitting at a table and saying, this is what we're going to do. Actually do a walkthrough, talk to other staff, make sure they are in agreement with what needs to be done. They know how to do it and can follow through with that. Another type of operational based exercise is what we call full-scale exercise. In this, we actually implement the responses and deploy resources. So this is a all hands on deck or boots on the ground type of exercise, sometimes referred to. People, your staff, are actually role-playing or acting out the responses. So again, kind of hitting on some of those same points. With the water main break, in this situation, you actually would maybe have a staff person where the facilitator would go to that staff person that's standing at a sink, washing their hands, and say, let's pretend that you have no water pressure when this happens. So now what do you need to do? Do they know that they need to validate that with other areas to see if it's just that one sink that's maybe not working correctly, or if it's a center-wide problem? And then do they know then, based on their findings, that they need to contact administration for them to verify or vet out the problem? The staff that are alerted of the situation, so you would actually announce that you have a water pressure problem and send out this message to your staff, and they would then simulate their responses based on that. Versus you just looking around and asking them a question. They need to then go to the point where they're closing off the toilets and getting new red bags or taping off the sinks. And obviously in this type of situation, if you do have patients or visitors still in your building, you would want to let them know that you're running an exercise, but their care will not be compromised in any way during the exercise. So a full-scale exercise is actually doing the actions to make sure that it's not just the administrator or risk management that knows what needs to be done or how you need to respond to an emergency. You actually play out or act out your responses during that. So those are the 4 different types of exercises: drills, tabletop, functional, and full-scale exercises. When we are talking about developing an exercise as kind of a sequence for a successful exercise, I know this looks like a lot of steps, things you do before the exercise, during the exercise, and after the exercise. So I'm going to hopefully pare this down a little bit. If you printed out the handout, I know it's very small in your PowerPoint handout. So I did, those of you that were registered, I did send you this as a PDF so that you would have this to reference to. But those basic sequences or components of planning an exercise include planning, the overall scope of the exercise, the concept, objectives, where are we going to test, and how we evaluate that. So when we're looking at what do we need to, how do we figure out what we need to exercise, again, it goes back to regulatory requirements, looking at your risk assessment, what could you having identified the risks or the types of emergencies that could happen at your center. Could be a follow-up to a previous exercise, to redo that exercise if you've made a lot of improvements, to make sure that the changes were effective and staff training was effective. It could be that you have new staff, you have new policies, you're in a new facility, or you have new equipment that needs to be tested. So there's a variety of different reasons why you would want to do an exercise and to look at what you need to exercise against. So we're going to talk about this planning process a little in more detail. And you do have, as one of the documents that I sent out this morning to those of you that were registered, you do have an exercise guide. Let me see if I can pull that up here real quick. So there is an exercise development guide that kind of walks you through a glossary of the terms we're going to be talking about and the different steps that you need to take to develop an exercise. There are basically 8 different steps to developing an exercise. So you have that guide that you can use in planning an exercise. So as we talk about this, one of the first things, obviously, to do is, like, who is going to develop the exercise? Is this going to be a single person, or are you going to have a team that works on this exercise development? You look at your needs assessment. Are there specific items or processes in your current plan that you want to test? Is there a specific type of incident that you need to test based on your risk assessment or hazard vulnerability analysis? Was there a corrective action that you've made to your plan or some additional training that you've done that you want to make sure to test its effectiveness? You determine the type of the exercise. Again, It could be a drill, could be a tabletop exercise, or an operations-based exercise, either functional or full-scale. And depending on the type of exercise, you may need to have some props. If you're doing a weather-related exercise, maybe go on the Weather Service and print out some weather reports or maps of recent severe weather that's come through, so everybody can kind of have a visual of what's going on. You might need to have your floor plans to reference back to. It's a good idea to have signs that you can post to alert not only your staff, but your patients and their family members that you are conducting an exercise. And then you might need to have some props for your actual staff. I know a lot of times when facilities do fire drills, they have a red piece of paper that they place somewhere on the unit or hand to a person and say, to alert them that there is a fire going on in that area and how they need to respond. Or you might have yellow paper for a spill that needs to be cleaned up. Or if it's a situation where your building has been damaged and you might have some injuries to your own staff or your patients that are there at the time, you might have what we call paper patients or victim actors to help you figure out how you're going to manage injuries within your building. Or if you're part of a coalition where you're going to have a hospital maybe send over some patients to you for procedures or for basic first aid level of care, some profiles of those patients so that you can kind of work through managing that influx of victims. You might also want to just have some things that you can, again, if you're going to have damage to the building, to simulate debris. If one of the things that happens, that we learned from the Joplin tornado was that one of the barriers to evacuating safely was the fact that all those ceiling tiles not only fell to the floor, but when the sprinkler systems went off, that composite ceiling tile expanded and became like a 2-inch layer of muck that had to be walked through. I'm not saying that you have to simulate that, but maybe just get some foam pieces to throw down on the ground to simulate that there's a lot of debris on the ground that you have to work your way around or through in moving patients and staff to safe areas. Not budgetary concerns. If you having staff participate in the exercise, are you doing it kind of on off hours, or are you able to, or do you need to back them up, pulling them away from their area? If you're doing a full-scale exercise, what would be the cost of replacing materials that you've actually used during the exercise? So again, going back to that example where we're doing a water main break, if we were doing a tabletop exercise, we would say that the administrator and the infection control nurse are going to develop the exercise. So our budget impact would be minimal in this situation. However, we would want to capture the number of hours dedicated to planning, conducting the exercise, and our follow-up activities as a result of the exercise. So even though the budget would come out of our normal, just day-to-day operating budget, you do want to capture the costs related to doing an exercise. When we're developing a scope, this is basically who, what, when, where, how the exercise is going to be accomplished. The scope defines the duration of the exercise, the location, and identification of the participants, whether those are folks that you have in-house or if you're going to work with someone outside of your agency. Again, going back to the water main break, an outside participant might be the building manager. So for again, as an example, just kind of working through this, using, again, that water main break. Let's just say we'll determine that the exercise is going to last an hour and a half. This includes our briefing, the actual exercise, and our wrap-up. We anticipate it's going to take an additional half an hour to an hour to write our written evaluation of the exercise, and we might need to spend another half an hour with folks looking at our corrective action plan process. We're going to do the exercise on a Thursday afternoon at 2 o'clock, so to minimize patient impact. We're going to do it at our facility, and it's going to affect all areas of the center. As far as participants, we'll determine as we develop the scope that it's going to involve all staff not currently providing patient care. We will alert the building manager that we're doing the exercise and invite him to be available either on site to help us deal with any issues, or that we could call that person in case we have any questions as we're looking through the exercise. So that's the scope, kind of, again, that who, what, when, where details of the exercise. From there, we develop what we call a purpose statement. We want to make sure that this kind of explains why we're doing the exercise and what we hope to accomplish. We want to keep it simple. So for the tabletop exercise, our purpose statement might be as simple as to provide an opportunity for the participants to practice working together as a team, allowing for recognition of everyone's role. So again, kind of keeping it very simple. For doing more of an operations-based exercise, you want to have a few more action words in there. It might be to provide an opportunity to replicate working conditions and actions within the facility, identifying resources that are necessary. For a higher level, those simulated exercises where we're doing boots on the ground, your purpose statement might also include that you're allowing trainees to observe the effectiveness of their responses during the situation and reveal potential conflicts or problems during the exercise. So again, it's very simple. It's just, what you really want to accomplish during that exercise. From there, you want to look at your objectives. What's your overarching goal that you want to accomplish from the exercise, as well as specific objectives for your staff to work towards. So again, using that tabletop example of water main break, the goal could be stated as identify functionality of written emergency plan and identify gaps in the plan and further training opportunities or needs. You might have 3 objectives that go along with that. Determine information sharing processes, meaning how you notify people, your ongoing communication, who you communicate, and how you communicate. Another objective might be to validate your plan for water conservation and replacement. And a third objective, determine impact on patient care, testing your written process for managing an incident. And for those of you that might be scrambling to write out all of this information that I'm giving you as an example, just realize that one of the things we have been engaged to do for IFASC is to develop 10 different exercise scenarios that you could just drop in place, as well as the exercise evaluation process for those scenarios. So all this information that I'm giving you, you will get as a template or a drop-in that you can use. So if you're trying to take detailed notes on what I'm using, so you can use this as an example, you will be getting that next month at the workshops. Also, I just wanted to say with objectives, if you're doing a functional or a full-scale exercise, you would want to make those objectives more action words, like demonstrate, complete, perform, establish, versus more passive things as far as determine or validation types of objectives. Once you've established your objectives, then you kind of have to develop your scenario, or basically the narrative for what's happening that needs to be responded to. The exercise, as it progresses, you want to have different messages or events that you inject into the discussion, or tell people that's going on that they have to respond to. And we call those messages or events, ongoing events. Another term that you may hear is calling them injects, again, because we're those events we're injecting into the exercise as it moves along. Those of us that have been doing exercises for a long time just refer to them as injects. Sometimes when you're doing a tabletop exercise, the scenario may cover a block of time. So you might just say on this day and kind of list out all the things that happen. If you're doing an operations-based exercise, you would give just a snippet of information to get the exercise started, and then provide those ongoing injects as the situation unfolds. So just again, going back to that water main break, if we're developing the actual scenario and we're doing a tabletop exercise, as the facilitator, I might share with you that on Thursday at 2 p.m., Nurse Rachel in the recovery area noted a significant reduction in the water pressure at the sink on the north wall. She called the pre-op area to have them test sink, and a staff person found that their sink was also with low water pressure. Rachel then called the administrator to alert of the situation. The administrator contacted the building manager to report the problem and received verification that there had been a water main break at the corner of 5th and Oak Street that would impact their water supply. They also learned that the water company said that it could take 24 hours to resolve the situation. So that's kind of, a jumping off point. From there, in a tabletop exercise, the group that's been gathered would then discuss how do we do that. The messages in this situation we would form as questions that might need to be answered by this group. Some of those questions might include, does this trigger activation of your emergency plan? If so, what processes are followed regarding establishing an incident management team? What information needs to be shared when, with whom, and how? What actions should be taken by staff to minimize the impact to patient care? What actions should be taken by staff to manage toileting and sanitation processes? What actions need to be taken if water is not restored in 2 hours? By close of business today, by opening of business tomorrow. And then you could expand on that if need be. In an operations-based exercise, we would, again, rather than reading this, we would kind of play act out the situation and inject or insert messaging as it goes along. So, again, we might start this at 2 o'clock, and then maybe in a half an hour, kind of rapidly move forward in the process and provide a message that at 6 p.m. you receive notification from your building manager that the water will be off until at least tomorrow. And so then what new actions would that inject trigger? Would it trigger that you cancel your surgeries for tomorrow, that you implement a fire watch program, because if you don't have water or your fire suppression system is probably not functional, and you have to do fire watches. And the last thing in your planning process is to look at your evaluation process. Who is going to evaluate the responses and the performances? So you need to have someone that kind of tracking to make observations. Are people on the right track? Are they doing what needs to happen? They should have some type of a checklist or a critique that they're using to take notes on. And again, for 10 different types of scenarios, we will be giving you not only the scenario and working through the process, but also the checklist that would need to go along with that. For any type of a situation, we follow what's called an all-hazards approach. So there are going to be some questions that would be on every incident critique, regardless of the type of situation. And I did send you a tool that is kind of an incident critique that you can build on. That these, again, kinds of things that would probably hit regardless of the type of incident that you're looking at in key areas as far as incident command, communication, resources, utilities, safety and security, and as well as patient care. But again, the checklist, there's all hazards, things that you need to kind of look at, as well as then incident-specific things based on the objectives that you've written. So some additional things that we might want to add to this critique for the water main break, do staff know to bar access to sinks and to close the toilets and bathrooms? Were the appropriate resources available to do this? Did staff know where to find those resources? Do you have options for alternate ways to toilet your patients or for your staff to meet their toiling and sanitation needs? If you're a type of center that has an eye wash station, do you have an alternative process to put in place for that eye wash station? Were staff able to identify interruptions to procedures and determine workaround processes? So again, kind of incident-specific questions that you would add to that basic critique. So we're going to look now at actually what happens when we're conducting the exercise. Anytime you're doing an exercise, you want to start off with a briefing process, review with your participants why you're doing the exercise, kind of review the objectives or what you want to accomplish, the process, explain what, that it's a drill, a tabletop, or an operations-based exercise, the timeline, and if you have any safety or security type of concerns. And again, when we're doing an exercise, we want to make sure that all of our communication during an exercise is preferenced with, this is an exercise. And if something is happening that is emergency related, staff should report that as a real world situation so we kind of understand the difference between exercise play and what's going on in real life. You want to make sure that you have everybody sign in that's participating in the exercise. And it's a good idea, too, that depending on the complexity of the exercise or the size of your group, you might want to have a scribe kind of taking notes to help record everything that's going on. You may have to have some resources that you gather for the exercise. Again, you want to make sure that you have written copies or printed copies of your emergency plan to reference back to. You want to make sure that you have a location identified for where it's going to take place. If it's a drill, it's probably done in situation, wherever that fire is happening or the chemical spill or your CPR drill. If you're doing a tabletop, this might be a large conference room or during hours after patients and visitors gone, maybe just your lobby area where you're doing a tabletop exercise where people can gather to talk. If you're doing an operations-based exercise, you might want to have what we call a command center. This could be as simple as your administrator office. If you don't have a break room or a training classroom or conference room that you can use for your incident management team to meet in. You just kind of want to make sure that you have appropriate information and equipment to run that command center, such as you want to make sure you have a printed contact list of your employees, how you get a printed list of your scheduled patients, especially if you have to evacuate your building or close the center and make those contacts from a different location, or any partners that you might need to interface with. Do you have their contact information? What kind of communication devices do you have in case your phones aren't working? Do you have internal radios? Do you have, can you use your cell phones? Do you have extra types of chargers for all the different kinds of cell phones and a power source to plug them into? So you want to, when you're conducting exercise, you have to get it started. So you need to have a facilitator or someone that's kind of jump-starting the exercise. In a small facility, a lot of times the facilitator, or even when we're doing exercises, and we have consultants assigned to even a big hospital, the same person is facilitating the exercise. They're kind of, saying, this is what happened. These are the events as the exercise progresses. But at the same time, they're also the exercise evaluator. They're taking notes on the performance of the hospital or the center or the agency that they're assigned to see how things are kind of going along. You want to make sure as you move forward, particularly if you're out in the functional areas of your center, not just in an office area or a training area, in case someone overhears a comment that you're making, and even for those that you're asking to play, that they understand that this is an exercise. So any information or new information that's provided, again, you always want to preference that with this is an exercise. When you end the exercise, make sure that you let everyone know that the exercise is completed. Either announce an all clear or make sure that everybody knows, including your patients and their family members, that the exercise has been completed. And if you've been working with any agencies or persons outside, either by phone or email or some other means of communication, that you let them know that you've completed the exercise. Okay, to evaluate the exercise, you again will have checklists or critiques that need to be completed to kind of document the evaluator's observations. You remember, too, this is a learning opportunity. We're not doing exercises to penalize or fault any one individual that they don't know what to do. You want to use an exercise as a function of, is your plan robust enough? Does it adequately give enough details of how to manage any type of event or specific types of events? And have you done the appropriate training so that staff know? If staff don't know what they're supposed to do, it's not because they haven't learned it, it's because you haven't taught them. Again, you're not faulting any one individual. You're looking at, do we have the appropriate plans and have we done the appropriate training? You want to make sure that you collect all the documentation. So if you do have a scribe or individuals are taking notes during the exercise, you want to gather those to use as a method for writing your evaluation of the exercise. And sometimes it's a good idea to have a camera or even just your cell phone camera to take pictures. It's kind of a boost to put those types of pictures in a newsletter for your staff. If you have a whiteboard in your command center that you're documenting on during the exercise or an event, it's a good idea to take pictures of what's written up there. You might even want to, again, using an example of the water main break, if you're doing an exercise and actually put a red bag in a toilet or tape off a sink, take a picture of that so you can document that it happened, or use those as training for new staff, or incorporate into your emergency plan as visual cues on what should be done in that type of a situation. You want to give everyone that's involved in the exercise, everybody that participated in the exercise, an opportunity to participate in what's called a debriefing process, or sometimes referred to as a hot wash. And I did include a document that shows a sample worksheet for a hot wash session. Again, looking at those 6 different critical areas for communication, resources, safety, staff responsibilities or duties, utilities, as well as patient care, for identifying the strengths and also the areas for improvement and lessons learned. So you want to give everybody the opportunity to share what they thought. And I always like to start these off with what do we need, what could we have done better, and then follow that up with the more positive, what did we do well that we can continue to build on. I always like to end it on a good note. So I always start with what needs to be improved, and then finish with, what did you identify as strengths. Lessons learned are just a kind of discussion of what could we say was a best practice or an innovative approach, or sometimes it's what an adverse experience that we just want to share with our other staff, or that you could take to your group as a whole through IFASC and say, we did this exercise and this is what we learned as a result of that exercise, and share that information with others. The last part of an exercise, what you need to do after the exercise is finished, is develop your written plan. Again, this, all of the regulatory requirements say not only do you have to do the exercise, but you have to have written documentation of the exercise, and that's commonly referred to as an after-action report. The after-action report includes the basic information of why you did the exercise, what type of exercise you did, where it was held, and who participated, as well as a summary of the incident, what objectives you had for that exercise, and were they met. Were they met with no problems? Were there some problems identified, major problems identified, or we could not meet those objectives? And I have provided you with an after-action template that you can use that has that information in it. Once you've completed your after-action report or summary of the exercise, you need to determine if any of your findings rise to a level where you need to do a corrective action plan. That could be more training, it could be rewriting the plan, it could be developing a new piece of equipment, or getting a new piece of equipment to help in these situations, or making sure you have some additional supplies or resources. So you develop a corrective action, and then you want to make sure that you test those actions as you implement them to make sure they're effective. Lastly, you want to give everybody an opportunity to evaluate the exercise process. Were the objectives clearly defined? Did the exercise meet your objectives by allowing enough time to accomplish meeting those objectives? Was the location appropriate? Did you have the right players involved? Did you have the support resources you needed, or the props to conduct the exercise? And the last thing you want to do, you want to make sure that you thank everyone that participated in the exercise, and make sure that they are given the results of the exercise and the plans for moving forward.